Over 2,000 years ago, in the city of Delphi, ancient Greece, there stood, and still stands, a grand temple to the god Apollo. Apollo was not only the god of the sun, he reigned over poetry, music, archery, dance, healing, and notably, truth and prophecy. And so here in the Grand Temple, the priestess known as the Pythia utilizes her connection to this god to communicate his insight to the mortals of the classical world. For centuries, the title of Pythia was passed from woman to woman, a chain of divine connection that held an immense amount of political power. People traveled from all across the ancient world on a few days a year that the Pythia would communicate, seeking insight into any number of struggles or questions as the Pythia sat upon a tripod seat and slipped into a trance-like state in which Apollo would deliver his messages. But to this day, the actual inner workings of the Oracle of Delphi and her mysterious role remain shrouded in mystery. She's largely been driven by years of pop culture contamination and conflicting accounts from centuries-old writers taken at face value. What was actually going on with the Delphic Oracle, anyway? Come learn with me. Side tangent here, it's a new month, so it's time to look at this month's channel charity. For February, I've actually chosen not exactly a charity, but something quite personal. My wonderful friend Katie, who you may or may not know as Thistle Thistle, is a brilliantly talented crafter, seamstress, and jewelry maker. She's such a kind soul and hugely inspiring, and unfortunately has recently been diagnosed with stage 3 breast cancer. As you can probably imagine, things are very scary and tough for Katie and her partner right now, so they've started a GoFundMe to help with medical and life costs during this brutal journey. I obviously have donated myself, but please do click the link below to donate if you have the means. Also, ignore whatever's going on in the background here. I just painted the walls and I'm still in the process of getting everything organized. Also, you can probably hear my cat crying outside the door right now. Ignore that too. So now let's get into the learning. But first, a quick word from today's sponsor, June's Journey. If you're a lover of history and vintage style murder mysteries, as well as any game that lets you decorate stuff, then June's Journey will be right up your alley, just like it was for me when I started playing it a few years ago. It's a murder mystery hidden object game where you play as June, who is investigating the suspicious circumstances surrounding the deaths of her sister and brother-in-law. The hidden object scenes are really reminiscent of those old I Spy games with how unique and creative each one is, with such well-crafted environments and delicately researched 1920s flair. Seriously, the tiny details in each scene never cease to delight me. As you follow the story, you find new clues, unlock prizes, and can use the coins you find to buy things to decorate your island. You can see here that I've been building out my island quite a bit, but there's still so much else to unlock and explore. The story gets more and more complex over time, introducing some really fun 1920s themes like bootlegging, as well as new and unique locations, and also really interesting side stories that expand the lore. And you can visit other islands or participate in unique special challenges. I found it extremely helpful as a way to de-stress while also keeping my brain active, and a game this artistic with such an interesting plot has been amazing. Download June's Journey for free by clicking the link below in the description. June's Journey is available on Android and iOS mobile devices, as well as on PC through Facebook Games. Thank you to June's Journey for sponsoring this video, and now let's get back to learning about the Oracle of Delphi. Papa needs the juice. I literally just got over being sick yesterday, and for some reason the only thing keeping my voice in working order is Dr. Pepper. Don't laugh at me. Around the 7th century BC, the Homeric hymn to Apollo gave history its first peek into the beginnings of Delphi, telling the story of Apollo's journey through Greece to find the perfect spot to set up his temple and later an oracle. After getting sidetracked several times, he finally settled on what became Delphi, located at Crisa near the Parnassian Mountains. There, Apollo slayed a dragon who was then decomposed by the light of the sun, thus giving Apollo yet another name, Pythian. He then realized that a temple needs priests, and he transformed into a dolphin to go chase down some Cretan sailors and lure them towards land. At this point, he undolphinified himself and was like, "Hey guys, my name's Apollo Dolphin. I know this is sudden, but I'm gonna need you guys to follow me up this mountain over there and build a temple to me. And also, you need to live there forever. Okay, bye. No, literally, he told them to call him Apollo Delphinios. Apollo is nothing if not an enigma, and sometimes very literal, I guess. Anyway, following the whole dolphin thing, the Cretans developed the town of Delphi, built surrounding the temple to Apollo. This isn't Delphi's only origin story, though. There's a whole bunch of them, all obviously fictionalized myths, but the fact that so many exist at all is a testament to just how powerful Delphi was as a city and cultural center. And somehow, over the course of centuries, a firmly rooted theistic oracular practice took root and remained there until the dissipation of the Hellenic world. The Oracle at Delphi wasn't just any diviner, though, nor was she a run-of-the-mill priestess. She was classified as a sibyl. Sibyls in general were prophetesses, and were attached to holy sites like temples or lived in caves nearby said temples. Lacking a personal identity, they took on a name attaching them to their sacred home, and they were famous for speaking prophecies by channeling the energy of the gods through their bodies, often described as speaking in a sort of mania or ecstasy. As Virgil wrote in the Aeneid, Book 6, "Arrived at Cumae, when you view the flood of black Avernus and the sounding wood, the mad prophetic Sibyl you shall find, dark in a cave and on a rock reclined. She sings the fates, and in her frantic fits, the notes and names inscribed to leaf commits." There were very few official sibyls in the ancient world, but out of all of them, the Delphic Oracle was the most sought out of them all. There is far too much that we don't know about the intricacies of the process of getting a consultation with a Delphic Oracle, because so much was simply not written down, or whatever was written down has not survived the ages. It was one of those situations where the power and process of the Delphic tradition was so long-standing and so vital to the classical world that most people were just like, well, everyone knows how it goes, so why bother explaining the details? They weren't writing for us, an audience over 2 millennia in the future, who no longer have that common knowledge or cultural context to fill in the blanks. A tale as old as fucking time. As many Delphi historians note, there's also the glaring issue of the fact that much of the detail we do have is highly unreliable sources writing long after the Oracle of Delphi ceased to exist, and often they have conflicting accounts or are actively hostile to the history due to being early Christians whose main job was to be poo-pooing the Hellenistic and other pagan faiths. The 1,000-year-long history of the temple to Apollo at Delphi and the Pythian priestesses who had such a huge influence on the ancient world is thus left as a murky, much-debated mess. But here is what we do know. According to Plutarch, who was himself a priest at the Temple of Apollo, and therefore much more reliable as a source, the Pythia would be chosen from women in the city of Delphi, from a respectable family, but not necessarily a rich one. The Pythia actually often originally was a virginal peasant, and upon assuming her role, she would lead a pious and chaste life in the home provided to her. In the early years of the oracle's existence, the temple was really popping off, so much so that Plutarch mentions that there would actually be 3 Pythias, one of which was an understudy. Over the years, as the crowds waned, only one became necessary, and she also began to be instead a middle-aged woman rather than a young one, in an attempt to deter the men visiting her from trying to pursue her, carnally. Well, I'll just let you imagine what happened to instigate that rule. According to lore, one could only consult the Pythia on the 7th day of the month, 9 months of the year, because during winter, apparently, Apollo would ditch Delphi to go vacation elsewhere, and Dionysus would babysit the temple for him. And I guess people just weren't interested in hearing what Dionysus has to say. Of course, on any of these non-consultation days, you could theoretically just show up at the temple and ask for some other sort of divination, but that's not really as good as having a word with Big Paul himself, is it? So if you were free on one of those 9 days a year when he was free for a chat through the Pythia, you'd travel a few days in ahead of time, like, I don't know, those people camping out at Target to get a Stanley Cup, or people posted up outside a stadium before a BTS concert. If you're about to leave me a comment about the BTS song called Dionysus, stop typing right now, I already know about it. And before you even got there, you'd have to use Delphi spring water to purify yourself, a thing that the Stanley girlies at armies probably aren't doing. And then you get in line. Locals are allowed in first, and then Greeks who are governed in some way by Delphi, and then other Greeks, and then everybody else. As for the Pythia, her consultation day began with a purifying baths in the waters of the nearby Castalian spring, after which she would burn barley and laurel as an offering to Apollo. Meanwhile, the priests would drip some pure cold water on a goat, and apparently if the goat shivered, then what that meant was that Apollo was ready to talk. And then the goat would be sacrificed outside and the day begins. It was actually fairly expensive to consult the oracle, although the price varied, depending on various factors. On top of travel costs, you would also have to locally buy a cake called a pelanos, which you would burn on the altar, and then another sacrifice, usually an animal this time, that you'd do once it was finally your turn in line. And then finally, you got to meet the Pythia herself. She sat upon a tripod amidst laurel trees in a special off-limits area of the sanctuary, a space filled with the artifacts dedicated to Apollo. This isn't a laurel branch. It's all I have though, leave me alone. This is where we get to the stuff that no one can agree on because the sources keep conflicting with each other. How did the consultation process go? How many people were in the room? How involved were the priests? We just don't fully know, although we do have a lot of theories, and even more theories come about when it comes to the mysterious oracle herself. The earliest sources are fairly straightforward. The Pythia sits on her tripod and chants, possibly in some musical way. Later, people claim she was shaking a laurel branch around as well. Mention of the ever-mysterious vapors doesn't come around until around the 1st century BC, when Diodorus Siculus writes that the chasm below the Pythia's seat emits a vapor, and that it was this vaporous chasm that began the whole oracle thing in the first place, because herds of goats that went near it would start to freak out, and the goat herds that followed them would start babbling prophecies. And so, obviously, the folks at Delphi were like, whoa, this hole turns people into prophets. Perfect place for a temple. Our buddy Plutarch also helps us gain a bit of insight into the nature of these vapors. Actually, I think he was probably the one who mentioned it first. Let's not focus on that right now. Anyway, contradicting the tales of people being driven mad by them by insisting that the Pythia was calm and peaceful during her consultations. Maybe that's why she was special, because she could handle the vapors. Not everyone has the makings of a prophetess, I guess. Well into the 1st century AD and beyond, though, a wide number of writers start making their own descriptions of the Pythia, all contradicting each other, and as time goes on, it becomes more and more obscure what the truth actually was. But why did people crave an oracle in the first place? Why did thousands of people, for 1,000 years, put such immense trust into the hands of one woman? Well, because although the Pythia was an incredibly huge figure in the realm of ancient Greek divination, she was hardly the only one. Actually, divination of all sorts was kind of everywhere. Michael Scott writes in Delphi, A History of the Center of the Ancient World, just about everything could be read. The flight of birds, although not the movement of fish, patterns of words, sneezing, entrails, fire, vegetables, ripples on water, reflections in mirrors, trees, atmospheric phenomena, stars, as well as randomized dice, beans, and other form of lot oracle. There was a lot of wandering cosmologoi or mantes, or oracle tellers or seers, who would be engaged on the street in any major Greek city for consultations, which could be conducted in a variety of ways, from the reading of appropriate oracle responses in books of oracles to connecting with dead spirits. But as Michael Scott is quick to point out, just because divination was everywhere in this ancient world doesn't mean it wasn't also clowned. Brutally. Not only that, but it sort of seems like most consultants of the oracle gave her like multiple choice questions. Stuff like, should I do this or that in this situation? The Pythia was almost never speaking in absolutes, but rather giving insight or guidance, nudging along people stuck at a fork in the road to one side or the other. Not only that, but the Pythia's answers were inherently a little vague, like as easy to parse out as the poetic riddles that most prophecies we're familiar with in pop culture today are. Plus, the multiple choice nature of the questions themselves let her off the hook in many ways. If you went to Delphi and asked the Pythia, say, should I drive to work or take the bus? and she told you something like, the path alone will never do. Commute via bus is the choice for you. And then you took the bus and you were late to work due to delays. Rather than thinking that the Pythia lied to you, you may think, whoa, if I'd taken my car, I would have been caught up in that 10-car pileup I passed on the way. So there's always the possibility that as bad as the outcome is, the other one she told you not to do would have ended worse. And if the choice she directed you towards ends up being good, then well, yay, thanks Apollo. In many cases though, the answer given was so ambiguous that it served more as an opportunity for the community to come together and deliberate further. But naturally, all this leads us to is the big questions. What was actually happening with the Pythia? Do we have a concrete explanation at all? For a long time, it was theorized that it was possible that when a consultant entered the inner sanctum of the temple and gave their question, the Delphic priest there would take the question into the room the Pythia sat in, and the priests would be the ones to construct the answer. Honestly, if you're asking my personal expert opinion, I don't really vibe with this. We don't really have any evidence for this happening, especially not for the 1,000 years that the Pythia existed, and it really just feels like a weird misogynistic assumption that the dudes in the room obviously were the ones running the show. Obviously, this assumption comes from the fact that, truthfully, ancient Greece was deeply misogynistic, and Ruth Padel notes that the ancient Greek men's anxieties about the polluting nature of women would have driven them to try to dominate them even in a religious context. But the issue with that is that most of her evidence is pulled from 5th century Athens, a wildly different locale and time period, and also, men's opinions about how women should act isn't necessarily proof of how women actually ended up living their lives. Lest we forget that whether or not the Oracle thing was a scam, for 1,000 years people came from all over Greece and the world believing that this one woman was the voice of a god. Clearly, these women were perfectly religiously capable on their own. So, honestly, let's ignore that and move on to the more concrete theory. What's up with those vapors? In his accounts, Plutarch described the vapors as sweet and fragrant, almost like an expensive perfume, and occasionally strong enough for those standing in the antechamber outside the sanctuary to smell it as well. Ye olde geographers Pausanias and Strabo also wrote of this vapor, the former claiming that he'd heard tell of a spring that flowed from the top of the mountain, disappearing into the ground until it rose up again in the sanctuary and made the women there prophetic, the latter noting its inhalation inspired a divine frenzy in the Pythia. As the story goes, vapors rose up from a vent in the floor of the sanctuary, and it didn't take long for them to take their effect on the Pythia. Scholars have long theorized over what vapors Plutarch could be describing, and they also hunted for their potential source. The first influential swaying of our modern perception of the Pythia's vapors came from a young English scholar, A.P. Opé. As French archaeologists worked to excavate the temple in the 1890s, Opé visited the work site at Delphi and noted that he couldn't see a chasm or fissure of any kind in the earth, and he discovered no report of toxic gases in the area. Shortly after, he published a paper stating these findings, which would go on to steer any further conversation surrounding Delphi's supposed vapors. His paper chalked up the mythologizing around the historical accounts to just that: myth. In Opé's eyes, all theories could be succinctly explained as local legend. Another damning rebuttal of the legitimacy of any vaporous claims came from French archaeologist Pierre Amondry, who in 1950 claimed that only volcanic activity in the area could lend real credence to Plutarch's accounts. And since Delphi wasn't a site of that kind of geology, well, there goes the vapors theory, I guess. With this mystery of the vapors at Delphi summarily disproven, all guesses as to what Plutarch, Strabo, and Pausanias could be referring to needed to operate with the assumption that there was no geological cause for the phenomenon. And so, subsequent historians raised other limited explanations over the years, often based in speculation and conjecture. Typical ancient studies problems. Stephen Connor suggests in Dumbstruck, A Cultural History of Ventriloquism, that the significance of the vapors was merely symbolic. The process of breathing while speaking signified a transformation of normal air into divine prophecy, and further suggesting that speaking is akin to giving birth. for some reason, I don't know. Getting back to the more material causes though, in his paper, the Pneuma Euthanasticon on the possibility of hallucinogenic vapors at Delphi and Dodona, C. Scott Littleton speculates on the presence of hallucinogens, though no true fireplace or hearth exists at the site that suggests burning large amounts of such a thing, unless you're counting the sacrificial pyres outside, and I'm not. There's evidence that some sort of smoke potentially passed through the vent and the clay omphalos that sat over it, and that smoke could have come from a fire made by humans. Littleton does say that narrowing down the contents of this potential hallucinogenic source is very difficult, and his plentiful suggestions make very little sense, by his own admission. Most of the stuff he brings up were not burned and inhaled in ancient times, especially the one he stakes most of his argument on, good old weed. The silliest thing about the whole weed suggestion is that it's just about as likely, aka unlikely, as any of the other plants or fungi that Littleton speculates on. Cannabis, a plant present in the region throughout history, is notably not documented in this period for the hallucinogenic uses that we're accustomed to today. Littleton argues, however, that since Delphi was a hugely important religious focal point in Greece at the time, that someone there, probably knew that cannabis could have an effect on the mind, which is obviously true, and admittedly just because we don't have documentation of people at Delphi partaking in 420 jubilations doesn't mean that nobody ever did, but still. The presence of burned cannabis at Delphi could also possibly maybe explain the sweet scents that Plutarch described, but in my opinion, that's really pushing it. Littleton admits that unless a study can be done to test the contents of any residue left by ancient smoke on the omphalos that sat over the vent, his theory is speculative at best. However, despite that, he posits that burning cannabis may indeed be the best kept secret of Delphi, and that the senior priest just kept it super secret forever. Even though there's no evidence of a man-made fire existing in the sanctuary, and no one wrote anything down about it, and no one gossiped about it at all for 1,000 years. And it also doesn't really explain why anyone even built this temple over this existing chasm in the first place, lest we forget the weird goat behavior. But yeah, man, it was totally weed. Whack speculative theories aside, for decades historians and academics volleyed ideas around to explain away these vapors. There could be no geological explanation for such a thing. That case is open and shut. Except, no, it wasn't. The seeds of vindication for the Pythia's vapors were planted by geologist Jelle Zeelinga de Boer. In the 1980s, he was part of a team sent by the United Nations and the Greek government to conduct a survey of active fault lines. As he worked, de Boer noticed fault faces running both east and west of the sanctuary site. He wasn't actually aware of the contention among historians surrounding the geography at Delphi, so he thought nothing of it and he moved on. That is, until over a decade later, in a conversation with archaeologist John Haugh in 1995, de Boer brought up that he'd seen the fault that ran under the temple to Apollo at Delphi with his own eyes. And Haugh, who had been taught the near century-old explanation of there's nothing there and the ancients were just yanking our chain, challenged de Boer on his assertions, but after listening to the geologist describe what he'd seen, Haugh concluded that this could be a finding of significant historical importance. So they packed up their bags and off to Delphi they went. In 1996, the team took their first trip to the Delphi site and made a few notable observations. The first being, the Delphi temple to Apollo seemed to have been built around the geology of the land rather than on top of it. Constructed with a sunken inner chamber with an elaborate drain for spring water built into its foundations, de Boer theorized that this temple was built intentionally around a holy spring. The second being, the two separate east and west fault faces that de Boer observed in the 80s were indeed the same fault, an active line they named the Delphi Fault. In subsequent visits, de Boer's team discovered a second fault running southeast to northwest along the mountain, which they dubbed the Kerna Fault, named for the spring that ran above the temple. The intersection of the Delphi Fault and the second Kerna Fault, as the team suggested, lay precisely below the seat of the Pythia. Not only that, but deposits of travertine, a type of limestone left behind when calcites dissolve in warm spring water, covered swaths of the mountain leading down to the temple, and even a retaining wall in the area. Though the spring that would have deposited this travertine had long since dried up, the report from the initial French excavation of the site back in the 1890s also suggested the presence of water, as reaching the bedrock had proved difficult for the archaeologists because their holes kept filling with water as they dug. Both the faults and the travertine deposits were a huge discovery that suggested that our buddy Plutarch's initial accounts could have geological explanations. Both phenomena proved that gases and spring water could have reached the surface through cracks formed by movement along the Delphi and Kurna faults. However, that left the question: what gases could come through such a crack to induce a trance-like state in the Pythia who sat above it? And how could the team prove their existence? And also, are you still with me? Because I know the geology stuff is a little dense. Take my hand. It's gonna be okay. Take my hand. The answer lies in the makeup of the bedrock below the temple. Bituminous limestone, a type of limestone with a high concentration of petrochemicals, the kinds of hydrocarbons often found in crude oil, natural gas, and coal. De Boer was already aware that this variety of limestone made up parts of the bedrock, as a prior study by Greek geologists had already confirmed that it was there under the temple. He compares the geology in Delphi to an analysis of gas expulsion through faults containing that same bituminous limestone in the Gulf of Mexico, as well as similar geological occurrences observed near the Isthmus of Corinth and the island of Zakynthos. With this information, De Boer concluded that when the faults running underneath the temple experienced seismic movement, that movement would create friction and heat up adjacent bituminous limestone masses underneath the surface, and then this heat would vaporize the petrochemicals within the limestone, and that vapor would flow upward through the fissures in the earth over time. Seismic activity is super common in this area due to its proximity to the notably active Corinth Rift Zone. Hence why Delphi itself actually got buried by a bunch of mudslides and earthquake drama and etc. Like, earthquakes are just a thing you have to take into account when you live there. So it's not really a stretch to imagine frequent tectonic movement reopening the cracks in the earth for gases to slip through. It wasn't enough to simply theorize, though, and after a century of insistence by academics that geology played no role at all, De Boer needed to prove it. The key laid in the travertine left behind in the springs at Delphi. When Jeff Chanton, the chemist with De Boer's team, tested samples of travertine deposits from around the temple, he found small amounts of methane and ethane, both hydrocarbon gases that could be formed from the heating of petrochemicals. Additionally and notably, water from the Kurna spring also contained ethylene, a different hydrocarbon gas. Both a naturally occurring gas and a byproduct of the heating of ethane, ethylene's most relevant characteristic is its sweet smell. Sound familiar? De Boer's team brought on toxicologist Henry Spiller to intuit what kind of psychoactive effect inhalation of these gases could possibly have, and Spiller had previously worked with young people using inhalants for intoxication purposes, huffers, basically, and he noted that their behavior when they were under the influence was very similar to those described of the Pythia in her trance-like state. Many substances used as inhalants do contain hydrocarbon gases like methane, ethane, and ethylene. Spiller pulled more information from the work of anesthesiologist Isabella Erb in her studies of patients under the ethylene-induced anesthesia towards the beginning of the 20th century. Erb ran groundbreaking studies on anesthetic viability of ethylene in small doses. A 20% concentration of ethylene would knock the patient unconscious, but a lower dose would induce an out-of-body trance, in which patients' voice and speech patterns would change, but their ability to sit up and respond to questions was not affected. Once the gas exposure stopped, the patient would completely forget everything that just happened and functionally return to normal. On occasion, though, a subject would have a negative reaction to ethylene gas. These patients thrashed around their limbs wildly and cried out, and this state of delirium left them incoherent and frenzied. Not exactly a pleasant response. This kind of reaction further aligns with the mythos. We do have one tale from Plutarch that illustrates an unexpected reaction from a Pythia. He describes her groaning, shrieking, flailing her limbs about before making a break for the door of her sanctuary and collapsing. Such psychological responses in the Pythia may not be particularly well documented, regardless of how frequently they might have occurred, and this seems to be the only account we have from Plutarch where a Pythia reacted like this. But The presence of ethylene could explain this kind of violent response. While it's really hard to state definitively, de Boer's team provided a mountain of solid evidence for their position. The petrochemicals in the bituminous limestone in the bedrock vaporized under the friction of seismic activity, and the resulting gases, including the sweet-smelling ethylene, wafted up to the surface, triggering a trance-like state in the Pythia exposed to them. In the years since de Boer and his colleagues published their findings, some of their contemporaries have gone to great lengths to discredit this theory. In one article, Darren LaHoux dismisses the claim outright, chalking de Boer's findings up to a ham-fisted attempt to understand the workings of the Pythia in our modern context, an understanding that he insists provides little or no value to the history of the Oracle's workings. LaHoux theorizes instead that Plutarch's usage of the word pneuma in his text doesn't specifically refer to literal vapors. Instead, it could refer to a wide range of phenomena in Hellenistic philosophy. And to top it all off, he insists that even with the presence of ethylene, there simply wasn't enough of the gas present in the samples taken from the site to induce that mythical trance-like state. However, in a later article defending his work, de Boer fires back and clarifies that while the amount of methane and ethane found in the travertine samples were small, the concentration of these gases would have needed to be significantly higher when the deposits were formed to even appear in their samples in the first place, and the present-day samples taken of the water at the Kurna Spring contained even larger concentration of the gases. De Boer notes, rather cheekily, that LaHoux's criticism focuses not on debunking the existence of any geological explanation for these vapors, which was the accepted story for nearly 100 years, but instead wishes to split hairs over the quantity of them or what kind of gases made up their composition. The needle has shifted ever so slightly towards validating Plutarch's original accounts. In the end, de Boer concludes by reiterating that these vapors were not something of myth or legend as asserted by A.P. Opé and others. No matter what contention surrounds other aspects of the tales of the Pythia, the geology of the region gives a clear answer to the almost certain origin of the vapors that helped Apollo to speak through the oracle. Getting back to our Getting back to our friend Plutarch, he actually theorizes that part of the reason the oracle system died out was because the temple chasm stopped emitting so many trance-inducing vapors. Among other theories, apparently was a huge source of discourse. Some said that it was because people were asking the Pythia stupid questions, others said it was because there were no major political issues to ask about. Well, major political issues are never too far behind you because soon enough, Christianity burst onto the world stage and writers began making quick work of recontextualizing the Hellenic world. They wrote that Apollo was in fact literally the devil and that he was using the Pythia as a tool to distract people from the one true god, even violating her physically. There was a brief little moment in the 300s AD where Emperor Julian the Apostate became basically a Hellenaboo and decided to disavow Christianity in favor of trying to reinstate Greek god worship. He even tried to bring back the long-defunct Oracle of Delphi. Tragically, for Hellenic pagans in the 300s, he only ruled for 2 years, so it was no use. Julian's Pythia, indeed the last one there ever was, left history behind with one last solemn prophecy. Tell the king the far-wrought house has fallen. No shelter has Apollo, nor sacred laurel leaves. The fountains are now silent, the voice is stilled. And so, for another almost 2,000 years, things remained quiet. People relegated the Oracle and her Sibylline sisters to the realm of heresy, devil worship, and trickery. Interest in her from an academic sense only really arose once again in the Victorian era, and when the rise of occult fascination and psychical research alongside fascination with the ancient Greek world plowed through Victorian society, spurring the new field of organized archaeology to take a new look at the mysteries that lay dormant at Delphi. The Society for Psychical Research especially had a special interest in proving the legitimacy of the Oracle of Delphi because it would reinforce their goal of proving that occult phenomena was real and humans could be used as vessels to communicate with spirits. But as we've established, The archaeologists who unearthed the ancient temple of Apollo found no pneuma, no fissures, no underground chamber. Since the 4th century, Delphi had long been pillaged and ravaged and was no longer the grand center of the world that it once was. The archaeologists, thoroughly disappointed and believing that the ancient texts were wrong, or worse, were a source of a great historic ruse, seemed to settle the matter until Jelle Zeelinga de Boer, John Hale, Geoffrey Chanton, and the others reopened the case. They vindicated Plutarch for sure, but so many questions remain unanswered, and as is always the case with ancient history, most things never will get an answer. It's hard to make peace with that, but it does allow us to keep digging, keep theorizing, keep arguing. I'm sure by now some of you have already gone down to the comments to make your opinions known. Was the Oracle truly channeling a godly spirit? Was she intoxicated by natural anesthesia? Or was the whole thing just a massive, extremely profitable scheme? Maybe we'll never know what the deal was with the Oracle of Delphi. I know what I personally believe. I think it was sensible enough, given the pre-existing framework of mysticism in the Hellenic world, that some ethylene gas would make people believe that prophesizing was happening. I don't think that that's being dismissive of the cultural context, as some scholars have insinuated. I think it's just a natural reaction. Either way, it's still magical on its own that the chain of oracles was able to persist so strongly and with so much trust and apparently great accuracy for over 1,000 years. No wonder the great mystery will never lay dormant forever. Apollo, the god of truth, still has some secrets to keep. Maybe he just hasn't found a new oracle yet. Thank you for learning with me about an ancient oracular mystery. Like most gay people, I think Greek mythology is so interesting, and honestly, the constant discourse surrounding it is hilariously entertaining. Let me know in the comments which Greek god or goddess you would have been a Sibyl for. Me personally, I think it'd probably be Athena. And don't forget to head down to the link below to download June's Journey. So until next time, wash thy hands, wear thy mask, and don't be asking Apollo no stupid questions.